Alright, Tokyo Game Show has come and passed, but there's been a few articles in regards to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth that have kind of slipped under the radar in regards to big story events and how things could play out a little differently. And there's one that hit a couple of weeks ago from the BBC, where they talked to Yoshinori Kitase and Naoki Hamaguchi, and while they do talk about something we already know, Kitase elaborates a little bit more on how a certain part of Rebirth could change from the original game. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, or if you're new here and you like what you hear, feel free to click the like button and subscribe to stick around. I cover Final Fantasy, and from time to time I like to cover other gaming things as well, so Resident Evil, some fighting game stuff, whatever kind of piques my interest. Now, before we get to that BBC article, it was recently announced that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will have its own panel at this year's New York Comi-Con, and that's going to be taking place on Saturday, October 14th from 3:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And at this panel, they're going to be talking to some of the voice actors from the game, including Cody Christian, who voices Cloud, John Eric Bentley, who voices Barrett, Britt Barron, who voices Tifa, Max Middleman, who voices Red 13, and Susie Young, who voices Yuffie. And interestingly enough, this panel will be hosted by none other than Matthew Mercer. I think it's pretty safe to say that Matthew is the new voice of Vincent. It sounds a lot like him in the trailer, and I think at this event in particular is when they will make that big announcement that, hey, Matthew Mercer, he's not just hosting this panel, he's also your new voice of Vincent. So this panel sounds like it could be super exciting, getting some behind the scenes info. They could potentially release new information here, maybe a brief trailer. It sounds like the structure of this event could be somewhat similar to that Final Fantasy XVI voice actor panel we had recently at one of the PAX events. So I think it'll be something along those lines, but seeing the cast of Rebirth come out and talk about their characters and their experience, recording through the game, that stuff always interests me, especially since Cody Christian's going to be there. He doesn't do too many interviews for the role of Cloud. He's done a few here and there, but for him to come out to a panel and talk with the other cast, that's a pretty big deal. They also do mention that there may be some surprise guests from Japan, so I think that could include maybe Naoki Hamaguchi, maybe Kitase shows up. Nomura's an extremely busy guy, so I don't see him being there in person unless it's through a video message. But you can also submit questions that you want answered on the panel. I believe you do it straight from the Twitter thread. Just put your question out there. I think they will take some of the best ones and ask them to the voice cast at this event. So this should be a lot of fun. Everyone's super excited for Rebirth. I'm a big fan of this voice cast. I think they're all incredibly well cast and their performances are incredibly well done. So to get a little bit more insight into what goes into that process, I think should be a lot of fun. So getting to this article, this comes to us from the Newsbeat section of the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, not the other BBC, okay? And in this article, they go over a lot of stuff we already know, like the game's going to be 40 to 50 hours. If you're throwing in side quests, it's going to be approaching the 100-hour mark, stuff about the battle system, exclusivity. And they do clarify the open world stuff a little bit more, so I do want to pick up on that. This comes to us directly from Naoki Hamaguchi, where he says that Rebirth won't be a go anywhere you want, do anything you want style of game from the get-go, like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. We start out with a fairly broad area, a fairly wide area to explore, but there are limitations on it. Then as the story progresses, as the game progresses, you get new abilities and open up new areas, and the game expands further and further. He then goes on to say that eventually everything will all work together as one space that is completely seamless. So towns and dungeons are all going to be coexisting in this map. So that's great clarification, but it's not really anything new. If you look at the original Final Fantasy VII, that's how that game was structured. Once you left Midgar, you couldn't just beeline it to the northern crater. You had to go to Calm, and then go to the Chocobo Ranch, and then cross the swamp, and then go into the caves, so on and so forth. So you had to work your way through that map to get to specific areas to unlock new regions, and then towards the end of the game, once you got the high wind, that's when you could go anywhere you want and do anything you want. And that's pretty much how most open world games these days are structured. So you look at a game like Ghost of Tsushima, which takes place across the entire island of Tsushima. And you start off on one point of the map, but you can't just make your way to the other end of the island towards the end of the game. Jin Sakai, the main character, and as the player, you have to work your way through specific regions of the island, liberating certain villages, defeating certain Mongol camps, gaining certain items that help you progress through the map. So you're unlocking these different regions as you go along and as the story progresses. So it's not just start off at the beginning, run to the end, finish the game, and then do all the other side stuff. So it's nice that they clarified that, so it's going to work pretty much how most open world games will work. But there was something else that we already knew. However, Kitase elaborates a little bit more on that, and it's the talk of the events of this game leading up to the Forgotten Capital, or the Forgotten City is what I think it was called here in America. So Kitase goes on to say, what happens there at the Forgotten Capital is going to be a big surprising development and a hook to get people interested and motivated to want to see what happens in the final part of the series. The second part of the trilogy is a very important one, and I don't think it's going to disappoint. And the author of the article goes on to mention big trilogies like Star Wars. You had The Empire Strikes Back, which was the sequel in that trilogy. And normally when you have trilogies, the second one is usually the best received of all three. And the second one usually ends on a cliffhanger. The Empire Strikes Back, for example, shows our heroes beaten. They're lost. The bad guys have won, and we don't know where they're going to go from there. And if you look back to the original Final Fantasy VII, again, I'm going to throw out a spoiler warning, and I know some people go, why are you throwing out a spoiler warning? This is an old game. Well, believe it or not, there are a lot of people out there who never played the original Final Fantasy VII and don't know about the game's story and its characters. There are some people, for example, who they just started the Final Fantasy franchise with 7 Remake, so they're on board now, but they don't have the knowledge that we had playing these games back when they first came out. So big spoiler warning, you've been warned. But what happens at the Forgotten City? We lose Aerith. She goes to cast Holy. Sephiroth shows up out of nowhere and hits her with a Hell's Gate that she's never going to recover from, and she's taken from us. And that right there really is kind of the Empire Strikes Back moment for that game. We lose a beloved character who we all really cared about. She was also great in battle because she was super powerful when it came to magic, and she could provide great health and support for the party. And the dialogue that happens when we lose her, the dialogue from Cloud specifically, is heartbreaking. And I remember being a kid playing through that part of the game, a 7-year-old, seeing this character that I grew fond of taken away from me, and I bawled my eyes out. And then afterwards, they expect you to do a boss battle with Genova, so as a kid, I'm like, just crying my eyes out, trying to pick my commands on the controller of what I wanted to do, and I was a blubbering mess. But it's a moment that still sticks with me as an adult. And that moment is pretty much the catalyst for the story changing going forward. Now, the way that Kitase talks about this, it really makes it sound like something different could happen. Now, it's important to keep in mind, perhaps Kitase is just throwing up a smokescreen to try and trick us, to get us to talk about something changing that we thought was going to happen. And maybe Aerith won't die, maybe something new will happen, but the same thing will play out. But it is possible that maybe Aerith does not die, at least not at that part of the game. Maybe she sticks around a little bit longer with our party and spends more time with the characters, and we might get an answer to that if we get future trailers that shows our entire party, including Aerith, at places like Icicle Inn. For example, because we know Aerith was never there in the original, so if we're in snowy weather and snowy environments and Aerith is there, although it could be some trailer trickery, that also could tell us that, hey, maybe Aerith does survive a little bit longer, or maybe, again, the order of events of the places we visit is in fact very different. So what could exactly happen that gets people hooked? Aerith could survive, something could go on with Zack, maybe Zack somehow enters the timeline that Cloud and our party is in, because yes, I am a subscriber to the multiple timelines theory. Or maybe, stay with me, Sephiroth becomes a good guy. There are some people out there talking about a Sephiroth redemption arc, which I did a video on a few weeks ago, of how he could potentially be redeemed. The Sephiroth we know, he's done a lot of horrible things, and I'm under the assumption that this is a Sephiroth from the OG Final Fantasy timeline post-Advent Children. So if that's the Sephiroth we're talking about, he's done a lot of bad things, and I don't know if you can really recover from that in the course of 2 games. But I also proposed the idea, what if somehow our party is able to get their hands on a good Sephiroth from a different timeline or universe who never snapped after learning about his truth when it comes to Genova and who he really is, and maybe he joins our party. So there's so many things that could happen happen at the end of the game to get people kind of like, whoa, this didn't happen in the original. Now I'm curious to see where this is going to go forward. So one last thing that we do have to point out is Kitase's wording to the author of this article, because it's very, very important, and it can actually probably explain this entire situation. It says, producer Mr. Kitase told Newsbeat, Rebirth's story will climax in the Forgotten Capital, the location of that iconic scene in the 1997 original. Now that word climax is very important because in terms of storytelling, climax doesn't necessarily mean the end of something. It usually means the height of something, the point where the most interesting thing in the story takes place. So it's entirely possible that the Forgotten City is not the end of the game. And you also have to keep in mind that they said that the locations we are visiting in Rebirth lead up to the Forgotten City from the original. However, the order of those locations will be different. So it's entirely possible that the Forgotten City is not the end of Rebirth, but it's in the middle. Maybe it's towards the end. And what happens at the Forgotten Capital could still mean Aerith dies, maybe something new happens that pushes the story forward and acts as a new catalyst. So I just wanted to point that out. It's very, very important. He's not necessarily saying that the Forgotten Capital is the end of the game. It's the climax of the story. So again, it could be halfway through, it could be 3/4 of the way through the story, we don't know. But either way, it'll be very interesting to see what exactly happens at the Forgotten Capital this time around. Is it going to be a repeat of what we saw in the original, or is something new going to happen? Or maybe they took the Forgotten Capital and moved it to a new spot on the map, maybe somewhere inside of the Northern Crater. We don't know. It really does kind of make you think, what are they going to change that would get people so invested in wanting to see what could happen, unless they, keep those events the same. So with that being said, that is the video. Let me know in the comments down below. What do you guys think about Kitase's comments? Do you think it's just a smokescreen to throw people off and surprise people by, hey, it's still the same stuff that's happening? Or do you think something different, something bigger is going to take place? And before you go, there's been a lot of rumors in regards to Final Fantasy VII Remake's exclusivity, and I talked about it recently, but instead of linking you guys to my most recent video, I'm going to link you guys to a video I did about a year ago where we go even more in depth with Sony's exclusivity agreement with Square Enix for games like 7 Remake and Final Fantasy 16. This was back when Microsoft was trying to acquire Activision Blizzard and they were battling with the CMA. Sony got involved, and then Sony had to show their hand in regards to some private documents. So there's some court stuff that we talk about in that video, but we go way more in depth with the whole exclusivity agreement. And I think I did a better job in that video than my most recent video talking about why a series like 7 Remake's trilogy might not go to consoles like the Xbox or the next-gen Nintendo Switch 2. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.